The gunshot echoed across the valley, sending a flock of startled ravens into the dusky sky as Flora Calloway stared at the blood seeping through her father's shirt. The year was 1879, and she had just witnessed the death of the only family she had left in the unforgiving plains of western Colorado. "Papa," Flora dropped to her knees beside him, the dust of Delta's Main Street staining her simple blue calico dress. Her father's eyes, already growing distant, found hers one last time. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the commotion. "Don't let Hargrove have you." Those were William Calloway's final words to his daughter before his chest stilled, and his gaze fixed on the endless sky above. Flora's trembling fingers closed his eyelids as tears streamed down her cheeks. Edgar Hargrove, the wealthiest man in Delta County, and owner of the silver mine where her father had worked, stood several paces away. His smoking pistol still pointed at the space where her father had stood moments before. "The debt is now yours, Miss Calloway," Hargrove announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "Your father owed me a considerable sum. Since he can no longer pay with his labor, you'll pay with your hand." Flora's head snapped up, her green eyes wide with shock. "What?" "You'll marry my son tomorrow at noon," Hargrove declared, holstering his weapon. "Consider yourself fortunate. Not many penniless orphans find themselves marrying into wealth." The crowd that had gathered murmured in a mixture of shock and resignation. No one stepped forward to defend her. Hargrove's influence in Delta was absolute. He owned the bank, the mine, and most of the businesses. Even the sheriff owed him favors. "I won't," Flora managed, her voice breaking. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "You will, or you'll hang for your father's debts. The choice is simple." Two of Hargrove's men seized Flora by her arms, dragging her away from her father's body. She struggled against their grip, but they were too strong. "Take her to my house," Hargrove ordered. "My wife will see that she's properly prepared for tomorrow, and someone deal with the body." As Flora was hauled away, she caught sight of a tall figure at the edge of the crowd. He stood apart from the others, his face shadowed by a weathered Stetson. For just a moment, his eyes met hers, intense, blue, and filled with something she couldn't name. Then he turned away, mounting a magnificent dun stallion and riding out of town. The Hargrove mansion sat on a hill overlooking Delta, a monument to wealth built on the backs of miners and the silver they extracted from the mountains. Flora had been locked in an upstairs room with only Mrs. Hargrove's maid to attend her. "You should be grateful," the older woman said as she laid out a wedding dress of ivory silk. "Vernon Hargrove is a catch. Handsome, rich, what more could a girl want?" Flora stared out the window at the setting sun, thinking of her father's body being unceremoniously buried without proper rites. "Dignity," she whispered. "Love," the maid scoffed. "Love is a luxury for the wealthy girl. For the rest of us, it's about survival." Night fell, and Flora remained awake, staring at the stars through her window. She thought of running, but where would she go? The wilderness surrounding Delta was vast and dangerous, especially for a young woman alone. Indians, wild animals, outlaws, death waited in many forms beyond the town's borders. The morning came too quickly. Mrs. Hargrove herself arrived with two other women to prepare Flora for the ceremony. "You're fortunate," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice as cold as her husband's. "Vernon could have his pick of any girl in the territory." Flora said nothing as they dressed her in the silk gown, arranged her auburn hair, and placed a veil over her face. "The veil stays down until the ceremony," Mrs. Hargrove instructed. "It's tradition, and it will hide those red eyes." "Have you been crying all night, foolish girl?" Flora was led downstairs where Edgar Hargrove waited, dressed in his finest suit. His son Vernon was nowhere to be seen. "Vernon is already at the church," Hargrove explained, noticing her glance around the foyer. "Let's not keep him waiting." The church was small but filled to capacity. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the wedding of Vernon Hargrove to William Calloway's daughter. Flora walked down the aisle on Edgar Hargrove's arm, feeling more like chattel being delivered than a bride. Through her veil, she could see Vernon waiting at the altar tall, handsome in a conventional way and wearing an expression of utter boredom. The preacher began the ceremony, his words washing over Flora like water over stone. She stood rigid, the tears flowing silently beneath her veil. No one could see them, these final tears of mourning for her father and her freedom. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The church door crashed open. "I have a reason," came a deep voice from the back of the church. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was the man Flora had seen in town the day before, tall, broad-shouldered, with those same intense blue eyes now visible beneath his pushed-back Stetson. "Xavier Farraday," Edgar Hargrove spat. "You're not welcome here." "That's never stopped me before, Hargrove," the man replied, striding down the aisle with the confidence of someone who feared nothing. "I'm here to stop this sham of a wedding." "On what grounds?" the preacher asked, clearly flustered. Xavier Farraday stopped just short of the altar, his eyes fixed on Edgar Hargrove rather than the bride or groom. "On the grounds that this marriage is being conducted under duress, and that Hargrove murdered this woman's father in cold blood yesterday." A murmur ran through the congregation. "That's absurd," Edgar Hargrove sputtered. "Calloway drew on me. Everyone saw it." "Did they?" Xavier looked around the church. "Did anyone actually see William Calloway draw a weapon?" The murmurs grew louder as people exchanged uncertain glances. "Furthermore," Xavier continued, "I have evidence that Calloway owed no debt to Hargrove. In fact, it was Hargrove who owed Calloway." Edgar's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. "This is slander. Sheriff, arrest this man." Sheriff Mills stood from his pew but made no move toward Xavier. "Before you do that, Sheriff," Xavier said, "you might want to know that I've sent documentation to the federal marshal in Grand Junction. If I don't return to confirm delivery, he'll be riding in with a warrant for Hargrove's arrest." Vernon Hargrove, who had remained silent until now, stepped away from the altar. "Is this true, Father? Did you kill Calloway over a debt that didn't exist?" "Don't be ridiculous," Edgar snapped. "This man is a liar and a troublemaker." Xavier turned his attention to Flora for the first time. He approached her slowly, as one might approach a frightened deer. With gentle hands, he lifted her veil. "Flora," he whispered her name with unexpected tenderness. Her tear-stained face was revealed to the congregation, causing another ripple of murmurs. Xavier's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Do you want to marry Vernon Hargrove?" he asked quietly. Flora found her voice at last. "No," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm being forced into this marriage under threat of death." The congregation gasped. Xavier turned back to face the crowd. "William Calloway discovered that Hargrove has been cheating his miners, recording false weights for the silver they bring in. He's been stealing from every man who works for him for years." Sheriff Mills finally spoke up. "That's a serious accusation, Farraday. Do you have proof?" "I do," Xavier replied. "Calloway kept records. I have them safe." Edgar Hargrove's composure finally broke. "This is nonsense," he roared, reaching for his pistol. Xavier was faster. His revolver cleared its holster in a blur, aimed steady at Hargrove's chest. "I wouldn't," he warned. The church erupted into chaos. People scrambled away from Hargrove, women screamed, and the sheriff finally sprang into action, drawing his own weapon. "Everyone calm down," Sheriff Mills shouted. "Hargrove, Keep your hands where I can see them." Vernon Hargrove backed away from his father, his face a mask of disgust. "You killed a man to cover up your thievery, and then tried to force his daughter to marry me." Edgar didn't answer, his eyes locked on Xavier's gun. "Sheriff," Xavier said without lowering his weapon, "I think you need to take Mr. Hargrove into custody until the marshal arrives." The sheriff hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Edgar Hargrove, you're under arrest for the murder of William Calloway." As two deputies led a protesting Hargrove away, Xavier holstered his gun and turned back to Flora. "Are you all right, Miss Calloway?" Flora stood frozen, the events unfolding too rapidly for her to process. I don't know." Xavier offered his arm. "Let me take you away from here." Flora hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his arm. Together, they walked down the aisle and out of the church, leaving behind a buzzing congregation and a bewildered preacher. Outside, Xavier's dun stallion waited alongside a black mare. "Can you ride?" he asked. Flora nodded. "My father taught me." "Good." Xavier helped her gather the silk skirts of her wedding dress so she could mount the mare. "We should get you somewhere safe. Hargrove has allies and they won't take his arrest lightly." They rode out of Delta, heading west toward the mountains. Flora didn't ask where they were going. Anywhere was better than the nightmare she'd left behind. The silk wedding dress fluttered in the wind as they rode, a strange white flag of surrender transformed into a banner of freedom. Xavier led them to a small cabin nestled in a grove of aspen trees about 5 miles outside of town. "It belongs to a friend," he explained as they dismounted. "He's away trapping, won't be back for months. We can rest here while we figure out what to do next." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace, a bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, and basic cooking implements. "I'll sleep outside," Xavier said, seeming to read her thoughts. "There are some clothes in that trunk that might fit you." "The trapper's sister stays here sometimes." Flora stood awkwardly in the wedding dress that now felt like a costume. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Xavier busied himself lighting a fire in the hearth. "I knew your father," he said after a moment. "We worked together in the mine when I first came to Delta 3 years ago. He was a good man." "You knew him?" Flora stepped closer. "He never mentioned you." Xavier's smile was tinged with sadness. "We weren't close friends, but I respected him. When he discovered Hargrove's scheme, he confided in me because I had once worked as a bookkeeper back east before coming west. I helped him gather the evidence." "And you were there when Hargrove killed him," Flora said, her voice hardening. Xavier nodded, his jaw tight. "I was too far away to stop it, but I swore I wouldn't let Hargrove get away with it or with forcing you into marriage with his son." "Thank you," Flora whispered, suddenly overwhelmed. The events of the past 2 days caught up with her, and her knees buckled. Xavier caught her before she hit the floor. "You need to rest," he said, guiding her to the bed. "You're in shock. Sleep. We'll talk more tomorrow." Flora didn't have the strength to argue. As Xavier stepped outside to give her privacy, she changed out of the wedding dress and into a simple cotton nightgown she found in the trunk. The last thing she remembered before falling into a deep sleep was the sound of Xavier chopping wood outside the cabin. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of bacon sizzling. Disoriented, Flora sat up, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. "Morning," Xavier said from his position by the small cast iron stove. "Hope I didn't wake you." Flora pushed her hair from her face, suddenly conscious of how she must look. "No, the smell of food did that." Xavier smiled, and Flora was struck by how it transformed his face. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-browned skin and those remarkable blue eyes that contrasted sharply with his dark hair. "There's water in that basin if you want to wash up," he offered. "Breakfast will be ready soon." Flora found that the trunk also contained a brush, which she used to tame her tangled auburn hair before splashing water on her face. She discovered a simple blue dress that, while a bit large, would serve better than the wedding gown. As they sat at the small table eating breakfast, Flora studied Xavier. "You said you were a bookkeeper before coming west. What made you leave?" Xavier's expression clouded. "The usual story. I wanted adventure, a fresh start." "There's more to it than that," Flora observed. Xavier looked up, surprised by her perception. "Yes," he admitted after a moment. "There was a woman. She chose someone else, someone wealthier with better prospects." "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "It was for the best. I wasn't meant for city life, for ledgers and numbers and stuffy offices. Out here I can breathe." "What do you do now?" Flora asked, curious about this man who had saved her from a fate worse than death. "A little of everything. I worked the mine for a while, did some ranching, some hunting and trapping. Lately, I've been scouting for the army, mapping the territories west of here." "Is that why you were in Delta yesterday? Army business?" Xavier shook his head. "No, I came back because your father sent me a letter. He was concerned that Hargrove had discovered what he was doing. He asked me to come help him get the evidence to the federal marshal." "But you were too late," Flora said softly. "Yes." Xavier's face hardened with regret. "I arrived just as Hargrove pulled the trigger. There was nothing I could do except make sure his death wasn't for nothing." They finished breakfast in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Xavier outlined their options. The marshal should arrive in Delta within a day or two. Once he has Hargrove in custody, it should be safe for you to return to town if that's what you want. Flora considered this. "And go back to what? My father's house will be seized for his debts. I have no family, no means of support." "You have your father's proof against Hargrove," Xavier pointed out. "Once the truth is known, the miners will support you. And there will likely be compensation from Hargrove's assets once he's convicted." Flora shook her head. "I don't want his blood money. And I don't want to stay in Delta where everyone will always see me as William Calloway's poor orphaned daughter or the girl who was almost forced to marry Vernon Hargrove." Xavier studied her thoughtfully. "What do you want, Flora?" No one had asked her that in a very long time. "I want—" She hesitated, trying to articulate desires she had barely acknowledged to herself. "I want to go somewhere new. Somewhere I can be judged on my own merits, not my circumstances. I want to live a life that matters." Xavier nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling better than most." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains. "I'm heading to Montana when this business with Hargrove is settled. There's good land there, open country. You could come with me." Flora stared at him, surprised by the offer. "As what?" Xavier turned back to her, his expression serious. "As whatever you want to be. A friend, a partner. I'm not proposing marriage, Flora. I'm offering you a chance to make your own choice for once." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. To leave behind everything she knew to travel with this man she barely knew to a territory she'd only heard stories about. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course." Xavier grabbed his hat. "I need to check if the marshal has arrived. I'll ride into town. You'll be safe here. No one knows about this cabin except my friend and me." After Xavier left, Flora explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was simply furnished, but had everything needed for a comfortable existence. On a shelf, she found several books, practical guides to wilderness survival, but also a volume of poetry and a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre. She smiled at the last discovery, remembering how she had devoured the novel when the school teacher had loaned it to her 2 years ago. Like Jane, she was now an orphan with an uncertain future. Unlike Jane, She had a potential champion in Xavier Farraday, but could she trust him? He had saved her from a forced marriage, true, but his motives remained somewhat mysterious. Why go to such lengths for a man he claimed not to know well? And what did he really want from her? Flora spent the day alternating between practical tasks, cleaning the cabin, taking inventory of supplies, and contemplating her limited options. By the time she heard hoofbeats approaching in the late afternoon, she had made her decision. Xavier entered the cabin, his expression grim. The marshal arrived, but there's a problem. Hargrove escaped during the night. The sheriff claims he overpowered a deputy, but I suspect he had help. Flora felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. He'll come after us. Yes, Xavier agreed. We need to leave, now. Where will we go? Xavier began gathering supplies, moving with efficient purpose. North, toward Grand Junction first. We'll resupply there and then head for Montana as planned. As planned? Flora raised an eyebrow. Xavier paused, looking at her. You're coming with me, aren't you? It's not safe for you here now. Flora nodded slowly. Yes, I'm coming with you, but not because I'm afraid of Hargrove. I'm coming because I want to. A smile spread across Xavier's face, warming his blue eyes. Good. Pack only what you need. We travel light and fast. Within an hour, they were mounted and riding north through the aspens, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. Flora had changed into more practical attire: trousers, a flannel shirt, and a sturdy coat, all found in the trunk and all slightly too large but serviceable. The clothes suit you, Xavier commented as they rode. Flora laughed, the sound surprising her after days of grief and fear. I look like a child playing dress up. You look like a woman who knows her own mind, Xavier corrected. Much better than that wedding dress. The mention of the wedding dress reminded Flora of her narrow escape, sobering her mood. Do you think Hargrove will really come after us? Xavier's expression turned serious. Edgar Hargrove is a proud man with a lot to lose. If the evidence your father collected reaches the territorial authorities, he'll not only lose his fortune but likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Men like that don't give up easily. They made camp that night in a secluded canyon, building only a small fire that wouldn't be visible from a distance. As they sat eating a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Flora found herself studying Xavier in the firelight. Tell me about Montana, she said. Xavier's face lit up with enthusiasm. It's beautiful country, wide open plains that seem to go on forever, mountains that touch the sky, forests so thick you can get lost just a few steps in. The winters are harsh, but the summers are perfect. And there's land, good land for those willing to work it. Is that your plan, to become a rancher? Xavier nodded. I've saved enough to buy a decent spread. Nothing fancy, but enough to run some cattle, maybe breed horses. He hesitated. What about you? What would you do in Montana? Flora had been considering this very question all day. I'm not sure yet. My mother taught me to read and write before she died, and my father made sure I continued my education. I could teach, perhaps, or work in a store. You could do anything you set your mind to, Xavier said with a conviction that warmed her more than the fire. They fell into a comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl the only sounds. We should get some sleep, Xavier eventually said. We have a long ride tomorrow. He offered Flora the only bedroll, insisting he was used to sleeping rough, and positioned himself on the other side of the fire. As Flora drifted toward sleep, she found herself watching Xavier's profile against the star-filled sky, wondering at the strange turns her life had taken in the span of just 3 days. The next morning broke clear and cold. They ate a quick breakfast and were on the trail as the sun crested the eastern mountains. Xavier set a pace that was brisk but not punishing, clearly mindful of Flora's less experienced riding. Around midday, as they crossed a high ridge, Xavier suddenly reined in his horse, his posture alert. "What is it?" Flora asked, bringing her mare alongside his stallion. Xavier pointed to a plume of dust in the distance behind them. "Riders moving fast." Flora felt her heart rate quicken. "Hargrove, possibly. Let's not wait to find out." Xavier nudged his horse forward. "There's a forest about 2 miles ahead. We can lose them in the trees." They urged their mounts to a gallop, racing across the open plateau toward the dark line of pines ahead. The dust cloud behind them grew larger, indicating their pursuers had spotted them and increased their pace. They reached the edge of the forest and plunged in, immediately slowing to navigate the dense undergrowth and fallen logs. Xavier led them on a winding path, doubling back occasionally, crossing streams where their tracks would be harder to follow. After nearly an hour of this evasive riding, they stopped in a small clearing to rest the horses. "You think we lost them?" Flora asked, her voice hushed. Xavier dismounted and helped her down. "For now, maybe, but they'll keep looking." "How many were there?" "At least 5, from what I could see." Xavier frowned. Hargrove must have hired guns. The gravity of their situation settled over Flora. "This is all because of me." Xavier shook his head firmly. "No, it's because Edgar Hargrove is a murderer who can't face the consequences of his actions. Don't take his guilt on your shoulders." A twig snapped somewhere in the forest and both of them tensed. "We need to keep moving," Xavier whispered. "Stay close." They continued through the forest on foot, leading the horses to minimize noise. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees when they came to a steep ravine. "We can't cross here," Flora said, peering down at the rocky drop. Xavier studied their surroundings. "We'll have to go around, north or south." Before Flora could answer, a rifle shot cracked through the forest. Splinters flew from a tree trunk inches from Xavier's head. "Down!" Xavier shouted, pulling Flora behind a fallen log. The horses, startled by the gunshot, bolted into the trees. More shots followed, bullets thudding into the log protecting them. Xavier drew his revolver, returning fire toward the source of the shots. "When I say run, head north along the ravine," Xavier instructed, his voice tense but controlled. "There's a hunter's cabin about half a mile that way." "I'll be right behind you." "I won't leave you," Flora protested. "You're not leaving me, you're giving me a reason to follow." Xavier's blue eyes locked with hers. "I promise I'll be right behind you." Another volley of shots forced them lower behind the log. "Now!" Xavier shouted, firing rapidly to provide cover. Flora scrambled to her feet and ran, keeping low, her heart pounding in her ears. She heard Xavier continuing to fire behind her, then the sound of his footsteps following. The ravine edge provided minimal cover as she ran, branches whipping at her face, roots threatening to trip her with each step. The sound of pursuit grew, men shouting, more gunshots, the crash of bodies through underbrush. Flora spotted a small structure ahead, the cabin Xavier had mentioned. She put on a burst of speed, reaching the door and yanking it open. The interior was dark and musty, abandoned for what seemed like years. She turned to look for Xavier just as he emerged from the trees, running hard. Behind him, she could see figures moving in the gathering dusk. Inside. She called. Xavier sprinted the last few yards, practically diving through the doorway. Flora slammed the door shut behind him, throwing the bar across it just as something heavy slammed into the other side. "Windows," Xavier gasped, trying to catch his breath. Flora moved quickly, closing the wooden shutters on the cabin's 2 small windows and securing them. The cabin plunged into near-total darkness. "There's a lantern on the table," Xavier said, his voice coming from somewhere to her right, "and matches beside it." Flora felt her way to the table, located the lantern and matches, and soon had a small light flickering in the cabin. Xavier was checking his revolver, counting his remaining bullets. 4 left, he muttered. Not enough. Outside, men's voices called to each other as they surrounded the cabin. Faraday, a voice shouted, we know you're in there with the Calloway girl. Come out now and we won't harm her. Xavier moved to Flora's side. Edgar Hargrove, he whispered. He came himself. What do we do? Flora asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Xavier's expression was grim but determined. We wait. They won't risk firing into the cabin. They want you alive. Why? Because as long as you're alive, you're a bargaining chip. Your father's evidence is useless without your testimony to validate it. Faraday, Hargrove called again. You have 1 minute to send out the girl, or we burn the cabin down around you. Xavier's jaw tightened. He's bluffing. He needs you alive. But he doesn't need you, Flora realized with growing horror. A thud against the cabin wall was followed by the unmistakable smell of lamp oil. He's not bluffing, Xavier said, his voice tight. They heard the strike of a match, and a moment later, orange light flickered through the cracks in the shutters as flames licked up the outer walls of the cabin. Back door? Flora asked desperately. Xavier shook his head. No other exit. The fire spread quickly, the old dry wood of the cabin catching readily. Smoke began to seep through the walls and floor. We have to get out, Xavier said, coughing as the smoke thickened. Stay low. They crouched near the floor where the air remained relatively clear. Xavier moved to one of the windows, carefully peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 men visible, he reported. Hargrove and at least 1 other must be on the other side. The heat was intensifying, the roar of the fire growing louder. Flora could feel sweat beading on her skin, her eyes stinging from the smoke. When I open this window, Xavier said, I want you to climb out and run for the trees. Don't stop, don't look back. What about you? Flora demanded, grabbing his arm. Xavier turned to her, his face illuminated by the growing firelight. I'll be right behind you. You said that before, Flora reminded him. A small smile touched Xavier's lips. And I kept my promise, didn't I? Before she could argue further, Xavier threw open the shutters and fired his remaining bullets in quick succession. There were shouts of pain and surprise from outside. Now, Xavier urged, helping Flora through the window. She dropped to the ground and immediately started running for the trees, hearing Xavier clambering out behind her. Gunshots rang out, but the gunmen, momentarily disoriented by Xavier's suppressing fire and the brightness of the burning cabin against the night, fired wildly. They reached the tree line and kept going, running blindly through the dark forest. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, but they didn't slow their pace until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. Finally, they collapsed beside a small stream, gasping for breath. The glow from the burning cabin was still visible in the distance, a beacon of how close they'd come to death. We lost the horses, Flora panted, all our supplies. Xavier nodded grimly. We're alive, though, that's what matters. What now? Xavier looked up at the night sky, orienting himself by the stars. We keep moving north. Grand Junction is maybe 30 miles from here. We can make it on foot in 2 days if we push hard. And then we catch the next stage heading north, get as far from Hargrove as we can. They rested only briefly before continuing their journey, following the stream northward. The night was cold, but the exertion of walking kept them warm. As they traveled, Xavier told Flora stories of his adventures in the West, encounters with bears, friendly conversations with Ute Indians, the time he got lost in a blizzard and survived by burrowing into a snowdrift. Were you scared? Flora asked after that last story. Xavier considered the question seriously. Yes, he finally answered. I've been scared many times out here. Only a fool isn't afraid when facing real danger. The trick is not letting the fear stop you. I'm afraid now, Flora admitted quietly. Xavier reached for her hand in the darkness, his calloused fingers warm against hers. So am I, he said, but we'll get through this together. They walked through the night and into the dawn, stopping only when the sun was well up to rest in a secluded hollow. Xavier fashioned a makeshift shelter from pine boughs while Flora collected berries she recognized as safe to eat. It's not much of a breakfast, she apologized, offering him a handful. Xavier accepted them gratefully. I've had worse. Once spent 3 days eating nothing but pine nuts during a scouting mission. They slept in shifts through the day, one keeping watch while the other rested. As the sun began to set, they prepared to continue their journey. We should reach Grand Junction by tomorrow evening if we keep a good pace, Xavier said, helping Flora to her feet. The second night of travel was harder than the first. Their muscles ached from the previous day's exertions, and hunger gnawed at their bellies. They spoke less, conserving energy, but Xavier kept a protective hand at Flora's elbow when the terrain grew challenging, helping her over fallen logs and across rocky streams. Dawn found them descending from the foothills toward more open country. In the distance, they could see the silver ribbon of the Colorado River. Grand Junction is at the confluence of the Colorado and Gunnison rivers, Xavier explained. We're getting close. They found a small farm around midday, where the kindly owner provided them with a simple meal and directions to town, after hearing their edited version of events, that they had been separated from their wagon train and lost their horses in an accident. Refreshed and with renewed determination, they set out on the final leg of their journey. By sunset, they could see the lights of Grand Junction in the distance. We made it, Flora said, relief evident in her voice. Xavier squeezed her hand. Not quite yet. We need to find the federal marshal first. Then we'll be safe. They entered the town cautiously, aware that Hargrove might have sent men ahead to intercept them. The streets were busy with evening activity saloons doing brisk business, shopkeepers closing up for the day, families heading home from dinner outings. The marshal's office should be near the center of town, Xavier said, keeping his voice low. They moved through the streets, trying to blend in despite their disheveled appearance. Just as they spotted the marshal's office, a sturdy building with the territorial flag flying outside, Xavier suddenly pulled Flora into the shadows of an alleyway. What she began, but he placed a finger to his lips, silencing her. A moment later, 2 men walked past their hiding place. Even in the dim light, Flora recognized one of them as having been with Hargrove at the cabin. They're watching the marshal's office, Xavier whispered once the men had passed. Hargrove must have sent riders ahead while he followed our trail. What do we do now? Flora asked, feeling the brief surge of hope draining away. Xavier thought for a moment. There's a judge in town, Judge Hamilton. He knows me from when I scouted for the Army. If we can reach him, he can help us contact the marshal safely. They circled around the main street, keeping to side alleys and shadows. Xavier led them to a modest house on the eastern edge of town. A light burned in the front window. Xavier knocked softly on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal an elderly man with white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Xavier Farraday, the judge said, surprise evident in his voice. What brings you to my door looking like you've been dragged through hell backward? That's not far from the truth, Judge, Xavier replied. We need your help. May we come in? Judge Hamilton's eyes moved to Flora, narrowed in assessment, then he stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, quickly. Inside, Xavier introduced Flora and explained their situation while the judge's housekeeper brought them hot tea and leftover stew. The judge listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Edgar Hargrove has powerful friends," he said when Xavier had finished. "But murder and attempted murder are serious charges, especially when the victim is a young woman." "We have evidence," Xavier assured him. "Documents proving Hargrove's theft from the minors. Once that comes to light, his friends will distance themselves quickly." Judge Hamilton nodded. "I'll send for Marshal Briggs. He's staying at the hotel across from my courthouse. In the meantime, you both should clean up and rest. Sarah will show you to the guest rooms." The judge's housekeeper, a motherly woman in her 50s, led them upstairs. For the first time in days, Flora had access to hot water, soap, and clean clothing borrowed from the judge's daughter, who was away at school back east. After washing away the grime of their journey, Flora felt almost human again. The borrowed dress was a simple blue calico, similar to what she would have worn at home, and it fit reasonably well. When she came downstairs, she found Xavier in the parlor with Judge Hamilton. Xavier had also cleaned up, his dark hair still damp, wearing clothes that must have belonged to the judge's son. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "Miss Calloway," he said, standing. "You look much improved, I hope," she said with a small smile. "Beautiful," he finished simply. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. The housekeeper admitted a tall man wearing a marshal's badge. "Marshal Briggs," Judge Hamilton introduced. "These are the folks I told you about." Marshal Briggs removed his hat, revealing thinning brown hair. "Judge says you have quite a story to tell." For the next hour, Xavier and Flora recounted everything that had happened since William Calloway's murder. The marshal listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting them speak. "And the evidence?" he asked when they had finished. "Hidden," Xavier replied. "I didn't trust keeping it on me, knowing Hargrove might come after us. It's in a lockbox buried near where the trapper's cabin used to be." Marshal Briggs nodded. "Smart thinking. I'll send deputies with you to retrieve it in the morning." He turned to Flora. "Miss Calloway, I'm sorry for your loss and for what you've been through. Rest assured Edgar Hargrove will face justice for his crimes." "What about tonight?" Judge Hamilton asked. "Hargrove's men are in town." "I have deputies watching the house," the marshal assured them. "And I'll stay myself. No one will harm these two on my watch." True to his word, the marshal stationed himself in the parlor while Xavier and Flora retired to their separate rooms. Despite her exhaustion, Flora found sleep elusive. Every sound made her tense, expecting Hargrove and his men to burst in at any moment. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Yes," she called quietly. "It's me," came Xavier's voice. "May I come in?" Flora hesitated only briefly before saying, "Yes." The door opened and Xavier slipped inside, closing it behind him. He remained by the door, respecting her space. "I couldn't sleep," he explained. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm afraid," Flora admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see my father falling. Or the cabin burning around us." Xavier moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Those memories won't ever go away completely," he said gently. "But they'll fade with time, and new memories, better ones, will take their place." "What if Hargrove escapes justice?" Flora asked. "What if he's too powerful, has too many friends in high places?" Xavier took her hand. "Then we keep running. Montana, Canada, Alaska if we have to. I won't let him hurt you, Flora. I promise you that." She looked at him in the dim light filtering through the window. "Why? Why risk so much for me?" "For my father's cause." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "When I first came west," he finally said, "I was lost. Not just geographically, but in every way that matters. Your father found me drunk in a saloon in Delta, convinced me to take a job at the mine to make something of myself. He saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. And then there's you. From the moment I saw you in that street, kneeling beside your father, I knew I would do anything to protect you. You don't even know me, Flora whispered. I know enough, Xavier said. I know you're brave and resilient. I know you faced a forced marriage with dignity. I know you've survived days on the run without a single complaint. His free hand moved to her cheek, gently cupping it. I know I've never met anyone like you, Flora Calloway. Flora leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them, Xavier's face was closer, his blue eyes asking a silent question. She answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a tentative kiss. Xavier responded with gentleness, his hand sliding from her cheek to the back of her neck, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, Flora felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I should go, Xavier said reluctantly. The marshal might check on us during the night. Flora nodded, though she wished he would stay. In the morning, after you retrieve the evidence, what then? Then we see justice done, Xavier said, standing, and after that, he hesitated. Montana, Flora suggested. A smile spread across Xavier's face. If that's what you want. It is, Flora confirmed. A fresh start, together. Xavier bent to press one more kiss to her lips before slipping out of the room. Flora lay back on the bed, her fingertips touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss lingered. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something like hope for the future. The next morning, Marshal Briggs organized a party of 4 deputies to accompany Xavier back to the site of the burned cabin to retrieve the evidence. Flora remained at Judge Hamilton's house, protected by the judge himself and another deputy. Xavier will be fine, the judge assured her, noticing her anxious glances toward the window. Briggs is sending enough men to handle any trouble they might encounter. I know, Flora said, though she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. It's just, Hargrove is desperate. A desperate man is dangerous. True enough, the judge acknowledged, but so is a determined one, and your Mr. Farraday strikes me as very determined indeed. Flora felt a blush creep into her cheeks at the phrase, your Mr. Farraday. But she didn't correct the judge. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Judge Hamilton tried to distract her with conversation and books from his extensive library, but Flora found it impossible to focus. By mid-afternoon, when there was still no sign of Xavier and the marshal's party, even the judge began to show signs of concern. They should have been back by now, he muttered, checking his pocket watch for the 3rd time in an hour. Just as Flora was about to suggest sending someone to look for them, the sound of horses approaching drew them to the window. Her heart leaped when she saw Xavier at the head of the returning party, looking tired but unharmed. She rushed to the door, flinging it open as Xavier dismounted. He looked up, his weary face breaking into a smile at the sight of her. You're back, she said unnecessarily, relief making her light-headed. With this, Xavier replied, holding up a small metal box. Your father's evidence, untouched. Marshal Briggs took possession of the box, and they all went inside. In the judge's study, the marshal opened the box to reveal a leather-bound ledger and several folded documents. These are copies of Hargrove's official records, Xavier explained as the judge examined them. William made them in secret over months. They show how Hargrove consistently underreported the weight of silver ore brought in by miners, paying them less than half what they were owed while pocketing the difference. And these letters, Judge Hamilton asked, unfolding several sheets of paper. Correspondence between Hargrove and smelter owners in Denver, Xavier said, proving he was selling the full amount and keeping meticulous records of the actual weights and values. Marshal Briggs whistled low. "This is more than enough for an indictment. The territorial governor will have to appoint a special prosecutor given Hargrove's connections, but with this evidence." "What about my father's murder?" Flora asked quietly. "Will he answer for that as well?" The marshal nodded solemnly. "We have multiple witnesses who saw him shoot your father in cold blood, and now we have the motive clearly established. Yes, Miss Calloway, Edgar Hargrove will hang for your father's murder." A weight seemed to lift from Flora's shoulders. "When will you arrest him?" "That's the thing," Marshal Briggs said, his expression turning grave. "We've been looking for him since you arrived, but there's no sign of him or his men in Grand Junction. They must have realized we were onto them and left town." Flora felt her newfound hope falter. "So he's escaped?" "For now," the marshal said firmly. "But not for long. I'm sending wires to every law enforcement office in the territory. His description and the charges against him will be known from Denver to Salt Lake City by nightfall. He can't hide forever." Despite these assurances, Flora couldn't shake her unease. As long as Edgar Hargrove remained free, she wouldn't feel truly safe. Xavier seemed to sense her distress. "Perhaps we should leave for Montana sooner rather than later," he suggested. "Once we're across the territorial line, Hargrove would be a fool to follow." Judge Hamilton nodded in agreement. "The northbound stage leaves tomorrow morning. I'll see that you have seats on it." That night, Flora slept fitfully despite the deputy posted outside her door. Her dreams were troubled, filled with images of burning cabins and her father's dying face. She woke before dawn, deciding to dress rather than attempt more sleep. When she went downstairs, she found Xavier already awake, talking quietly with Marshal Briggs in the kitchen. "Morning," Xavier greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We were just discussing our travel plans." "Is something wrong?" Flora asked, noticing the tension in both men's postures. The marshal sighed. "One of my deputies spotted 2 of Hargrove's men at the stage depot late last night. They were asking questions about the northbound stage." "He knows we're leaving," Flora realized, her stomach sinking. Xavier nodded grimly. "It seems so. What do we do now?" Marshal Briggs squared his shoulders. "I've arranged for a wagon and escort to take you to the next town, North Palisade. You can catch the stage there instead. It's only about 10 miles, but it should be enough to throw Hargrove off your trail." "When do we leave?" Xavier asked. "Now," the marshal replied. "Before the town fully wakes. Judge Hamilton is preparing some provisions for your journey." Within an hour, they were in a covered wagon driven by one of the marshal's most trusted deputies, with 2 more riding escort. Flora and Xavier sat in the back, hidden from view by the canvas covering. "I'm sorry," Xavier said as the wagon rumbled out of town. "I promised you'd be safe." Flora reached for his hand. "You've done everything possible to protect me. This isn't your fault." "Still," Xavier sighed, "I hoped it would be over by now, that you could travel to Montana without looking over your shoulder." "We will," Flora assured him with more confidence than she felt. "Once we're across the territorial line, and then we'll build that ranch you talked about. Raise cattle and horses." Xavier's expression softened. "And children?" "Someday." The question caught Flora by surprise, but the image it conjured of children with Xavier's blue eyes and her auburn hair running across Montana grasslands filled her with unexpected yearning. "Yes," she said softly. "Someday." Xavier's hand tightened around hers. "Flora Calloway, when we reach Montana and get settled, would you consider—" A shout from outside interrupted him, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. The wagon lurched as the horses startled. "Get down!" Xavier yelled, pushing Flora to the floor of the wagon as more shots rang out. They heard the deputy driver cry out in pain, and the wagon veered sharply to the right before coming to a sudden stop. Outside, the escorts were returning fire, their shouts indicating they were outnumbered. "We need to run," Xavier said, reaching for the pistol Marshal Briggs had provided him. "When I say go, head for those rocks." He pointed to a rocky outcrop about 50 yards from the road. One of their escorts screamed, then fell silent. The other was still firing, but his shots were coming less frequently. "Now." Xavier flung back the canvas and helped Flora down from the wagon. They ran for the rocks, bullets kicking up dust at their feet. Xavier fired back, providing what cover he could. They had almost reached safety when Flora felt a searing pain in her left arm. She stumbled but kept running, Xavier's hand firm on her back, guiding her. They reached the rocks and collapsed behind them, gasping for breath. Xavier immediately examined her arm. "Grazed you," he said, relief evident in his voice. "It's bleeding but not serious." He tore a strip from his shirt and quickly bound the wound. "Can you still run?" Flora nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. "Yes." Xavier peered around the rocks. "They're searching the wagon." "We have maybe a minute before they realize we're gone." He scanned their surroundings. They were in open country, the road behind them, low hills ahead. To the left, the land sloped down toward the Colorado River. To the right, more exposed plain. The river, Xavier decided. "If we can reach it, we might find a boat or at least be able to follow it to Palisade." They moved from the rocks, staying low, heading for the distant gleam of water. They had covered perhaps 100 yards when a shout indicated they'd been spotted. "Run," Xavier urged, taking Flora's hand. They ran full out now, abandoning any attempt at stealth. The river seemed impossibly far away, and the sound of horses in pursuit grew louder with each passing second. Just as Flora thought her lungs would burst, they reached a steep bank overlooking the Colorado. Below, the river flowed swift and deep, its surface broken by occasional rocks. "We have to jump," Xavier said, looking back at their pursuers, now clearly visible and closing fast. Flora looked at the churning water below. "I can't swim well," she admitted. Xavier squeezed her hand. "Hold on to me. Don't let go, no matter what." Before she could respond, he pulled her with him over the edge of the bank. They plummeted toward the water, hitting its surface with a shock that drove the air from Flora's lungs. The current immediately seized them, pulling them downstream at a frightening pace. True to his word, Xavier kept a firm grip on her, his strong strokes fighting the current enough to keep their heads above water. From the bank above, they heard shouts and then gunshots, but the river carried them swiftly away from danger. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only minutes, Xavier managed to guide them toward the shore. They dragged themselves onto a rocky beach, coughing and gasping. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked as soon as he could speak. Flora nodded, too breathless for words. Her arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed her, but the makeshift bandage had held. Xavier collapsed beside her, his chest heaving. "I don't think they'll follow us downriver. Too dangerous to bring horses down that bank." "What now?" Flora asked when she finally caught her breath. Xavier sat up, surveying their surroundings. "We follow the river to Palisade. It can't be more than a few miles now." They rested only briefly before continuing their journey, staying close to the riverbank but far enough inland to avoid being seen from the water. Their clothes dried slowly in the afternoon sun as they walked. "I never finished what I was saying," Xavier said after they had been walking for some time. "In the wagon before the attack," Flora glanced at him. "You were asking if I would consider something." Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her. Despite his wet, bedraggled appearance, his blue eyes were intense and focused. "I was going to ask if you would consider becoming my wife," he said simply. "Not right away. When we're settled in Montana, when you've had time to know your own mind. But someday." Flora felt a warmth spreading through her chest despite her damp clothing and aching arm. "Are you proposing to me while we're running for our lives, Xavier Farraday?" A smile tugged at his lips. "I suppose I am. Not very romantic, is it?" "On the contrary," Flora said, stepping closer to him. "I think it's perfectly fitting for us." "Is that a yes?" "It's a ask me again when we reach Montana," Flora replied with a small smile, but with a very strong indication that my answer will be favorable. Xavier's smile widened. He leaned down to kiss her, his lips warm despite their recent immersion in the cold river. They reached Palisade as the sun was setting, tired, hungry, and still damp. The small settlement consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and the stage depot. At the latter, they learned that the northbound stage wouldn't arrive until morning. "We need a safe place to spend the night," Xavier told the depot manager, "and to send a message to Marshal Briggs in Grand Junction." The depot manager, a weathered man with kind eyes, took in their bedraggled appearance and Xavier's obvious protective stance toward Flora. "Trouble?" he asked simply. "Yes," Xavier admitted, "but not of our making." The man nodded. "My sister runs the boarding house just down the street. She'll give you a room and a hot meal. As for the marshal, I can send a rider tonight." True to the depot manager's word, his sister welcomed them warmly, asking no questions about their appearance or circumstances. She provided them with a hot meal, dry clothes borrowed from her own wardrobe and her late husband's closet, and a small but clean room with 2 narrow beds. "Thank you for your kindness," Flora said as the woman showed them to their room. "My brother has good judgment about people," the woman replied with a smile. "If he says you need help, that's enough for me." Left alone, Flora sank onto one of the beds, the events of the day catching up with her. Xavier sat beside her, his hand finding hers. "You should rest," he said. "We have an early stage to catch." Flora nodded, exhaustion washing over her. "Will you stay?" "Just until I fall asleep." "Of course," Xavier promised, moving to sit on the other bed so she could lie down. Flora closed her eyes, listening to Xavier's steady breathing across the small room. Despite everything they'd been through, she felt safe with him nearby. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that perhaps her father had somehow guided Xavier to her, knowing she would need him. She woke to gray pre-dawn light filtering through the curtains. Xavier was already up, looking out the window with a tense posture. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up. "Riders," Xavier replied without turning. "6 of them just arrived in town." Flora's heart sank. "Hargrove? I can't tell from here, but it seems likely." Xavier finally turned to face her. "We need to get to the stage depot now, before they start searching the town." They left through the back door of the boarding house, thanking the owner's sister for her hospitality and warning her to say nothing if strangers came asking for them. The stage depot was just opening when they arrived, the depot manager looking surprised to see them so early. "Stage isn't due for another hour," he informed them. "We need to leave now," Xavier said urgently. The men we're avoiding just rode into town. The depot manager's expression hardened. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into a back room. He returned moments later with a key. "Take my wagon," he said, pressing the key into Xavier's hand. "It's behind the depot. My brother-in-law runs the livery in a town called Rifle, about 30 miles north. Tell him Joe sent you." "We can't take your wagon," Flora protested. "You can and you will," the man insisted. "I don't know what trouble you're in, but I know trouble when I see it, and I know decent folk when I see them too." Xavier clasped the man's hand firmly. "Thank you. We'll make sure it's returned." "See that you do," the man replied with a nod. "Now go, before those riders start asking questions." They slipped out the back of the depot to where a sturdy wagon with 2 reliable-looking horses waited. Xavier helped Flora up, then took the reins, guiding the horses onto a back trail that circled around the small settlement before rejoining the main road north. "You think we've lost them for good?" Flora asked as Palisade disappeared behind them. Xavier shook his head. "Hargrove is too determined. But this gives us a head start, and the further north we go, the safer we'll be." They traveled all day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat some provisions the boarding house owner had pressed upon them. By evening they reached the small town of Rifle, where the livery owner welcomed them cautiously until they mentioned Joe's name. "My brother-in-law doesn't loan his wagon to just anyone," the man said, eyeing them with new respect. "You must have impressed him." "We're trying to reach Montana," Xavier explained. "There are men pursuing us who mean us harm." The livery owner nodded slowly. "The stage comes through here tomorrow heading north to Meeker. From there, you can connect to the line that runs all the way to Wyoming territory, and then on to Montana." They spent the night in a small room above the livery, both too exhausted for conversation. In the morning, the livery owner's wife brought them breakfast and fresh clothing. "These belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Denver," she told Flora, handing her a simple dress and shawl. "They should fit you well enough." "Thank you," Flora said, touched by the continued kindness of strangers. "My husband says you're running from something," the woman said, her eyes kind but direct. "I won't ask what, but if you need help you only have to ask." Flora smiled gratefully. "You've already helped more than you know." The stage arrived mid-morning, with only 2 other passengers, an elderly gentleman returning to his home in Wyoming, and a young man heading to Meeker for business. Xavier and Flora took seats at the back of the coach, Xavier positioning himself protectively between Flora and the door. As the stage pulled away from Rifle, Flora felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to believe that escape might truly be possible, that a new life awaited her in Montana. Xavier must have sensed her change in mood, for he took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "We're going to make it," he said quietly. The journey to Meeker passed uneventfully, the coach traveling through increasingly rugged country as they headed north. In Meeker, they changed to another stage bound for the Wyoming territory, and it was there that they finally received news about Edgar Hargrove. "You the folks Marshal Briggs wired about?" the station manager asked as they waited for the new stage to be readied. Xavier tensed, immediately alert. "Yes." The manager handed him a telegram. "This came for you yesterday." Xavier read it quickly, his expression shifting from tension to relief. "Hargrove's been captured," he told Flora, passing her the telegram. "Briggs and a posse caught him trying to cross into Utah territory. He's being taken back to Grand Junction to stand trial." Flora read the words for herself, hardly daring to believe them. "It's over?" she asked, looking up at Xavier. "Truly over, truly," Xavier confirmed, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You're safe now, Flora." The realization was almost too much to process. For days they had been running, always looking over their shoulders, always expecting Hargrove and his men to appear at any moment. And now, suddenly, the threat was gone. "What about the men who were following us?" Flora asked. "The ones who attacked the wagon. Briggs says they captured 3 of Hargrove's men with him. The others are still at large, but without Hargrove to pay them, they have no reason to continue pursuing us." The station manager, who had been listening to their conversation, cleared his throat. "Stage is ready whenever you folks are." They boarded the northbound stage with lighter hearts, sitting side by side as the coach rumbled out of Meeker. Xavier kept his arm around Flora's shoulders, and she leaned into his embrace, allowing herself to truly relax for the first time in what felt like forever. "When we reach Montana," Xavier said softly, his lips close to her ear, "I'm going to build you a home on the prettiest piece of land I can find, with a view of the mountains and room for horses to run." Flora closed her eyes, imagining it. "And a garden," she added, "with vegetables and flowers." "And children," Xavier continued, his voice warm with promise. "Strong sons and daughters with your courage and spirit." "And your blue eyes," Flora murmured, turning her face up to his. Xavier smiled down at her. "Flora Calloway, will you marry me? Not because you need protection or because we've been through hell together, but because I love you and can't imagine my life without you." Flora felt tears welling in her eyes, but for the first time in days, they were tears of joy rather than fear or grief. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier Farraday." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and future, witnessed only by their fellow passengers who politely pretended not to notice. The journey to Montana took several more days, changing stages twice more as they moved ever northward. Spring was giving way to summer as they crossed into Montana territory. The landscape, opening up into vast prairies dotted with wildflowers and distant herds of cattle. They arrived in Helena on a bright June morning, the territorial capital bustling with activity. Xavier led Flora to a modest hotel where they took separate rooms, maintaining propriety despite their engagement. "Tomorrow we'll find a preacher," Xavier promised as they parted in the hotel hallway. "Unless you want to wait, have a proper wedding with a dress and guests." Flora shook her head. "I've already worn one wedding dress I didn't want. All I need for this wedding is you." The next day, they were married in a simple ceremony at the local church, with the hotel proprietor and his wife as witnesses. Flora wore her borrowed blue dress, and Xavier had purchased a new shirt for the occasion, though his trail-worn pants and boots remained the same. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Xavier lifted Flora's face to his eyes filled with a love that made her heart swell, he whispered, "Flora." Her name a benediction on his lips before he sealed their vows with a tender kiss. They spent a week in Helena, resting from their journey and purchasing supplies for their new life. Xavier had money saved from his years of work, enough to buy land and basic necessities. They selected a plot of land near a town called Riverside, about 40 miles east of Helena, 160 acres of good grassland with a creek running through it and mountains visible in the distance. By late summer, they had built a small cabin and purchased a modest herd of cattle and 4 horses. The work was hard, but they faced it together, building their dream one day at a time. Word eventually reached them that Edgar Hargrove had been tried and convicted of the murder of William Calloway and the theft of silver from his miners. He was sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out in September of that year. The news brought Flora a sense of closure rather than satisfaction, allowing her to finally put the past behind her. As winter approached, their cabin had become a home, with curtains at the windows and a garden plot marked out for the following spring. Xavier added a small stable for the horses and pens for the chickens they had acquired from a neighboring ranch. On a crisp November evening, as they sat before the fire in their snug cabin, Xavier presented Flora with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Open it and see," he urged with a smile. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound book with blank pages and a pencil. "I thought you might like to write down your father's story," Xavier explained, "and our story, for our children someday." Flora traced the cover with her fingertips, deeply moved by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." That night, as snow began to fall outside their cabin window, Flora wrote the first entry in her new book. "My name is Flora Faraday, formerly Calloway. This is the story of how I lost everything, found love in the most unexpected place, and built a new life on the Montana frontier. The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Their herd grew, as did their reputation for raising quality cattle and fine horses. Xavier's skill with animals and Flora's head for business proved a formidable combination. In the spring of 1881, their first child was born, a son they named William Xavier, after both Flora's father and his own. He had Xavier's blue eyes and Flora's auburn hair, a perfect blend of them both. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, followed by twin boys in 1885. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their now expanded home watching their children play in the yard, Xavier took Flora's hand. "Any regrets?" he asked. About following a near stranger to Montana, Flora looked at their home, their land, their children, and finally at the man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Not a single one," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Every tear I shed beneath that wedding veil was worth it to find my way to you." Xavier kissed her temple gently. "And every mile I traveled to find you was worth it to hear you say my name the way you do." Flora turned her face to his, whispering, "Xavier," with all the love in her heart before their lips met in a kiss that held the promise of many more anniversaries to come. In later years, when their children were grown and had children of their own, Flora would sometimes take out her leather-bound book and read from it on winter evenings. The story of a forced bride who hid her tears beneath her veil, and the cowboy who lifted it and whispered her name, had become a family legend, a tale of courage, perseverance, and a love that had overcome every obstacle life had placed in its path. And in the quiet moments when she and Xavier were alone, Flora would look into those still vibrant blue eyes and see the same love that had first kindled in a dusty street in Delta, Colorado. All those years ago, a love that had only grown stronger with each passing season, each challenge overcome, each joy shared. In the end, it was not the land or the cattle or even their children that Flora counted as her greatest blessing. It was the love of a man who had seen her tears and had dried them, who had taken her hand and led her to safety, who had built her a home and filled it with laughter and light. That love, she knew, would endure long after they were gone, passed down through generations in the stories they told, in the land they tended, and in the legacy of love they left behind.